right, good evening and welcome to the California African American Museum, or as I like to say, Virtual CAM. My name is Alexandra Mitchell. I am the Manager of Education and Public Programs at CAM. We are delighted that you've chosen to spend a portion of your day with us for what is sure to be a very special presentation. Before I begin tonight's introductions, I want to send a big thank you to the site's organization at the Smithsonian for their work with this exhibition, as well as the Ford Motor Company for their support of public programs and of the exhibition at CAM. Tonight's program is the second in a series of programs, highlighting the many dynamic men profiled in men of change, power, triumph, and truth. We are joined by two of our nation's leading scholars and leaders in higher education. Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell's text in American Odyssey, the life and work of Romare Bearden, along with Dr. O'Mealy and Site's co-curated exhibition, Romare Bearden, A Black Odyssey, which explored Bearden's Odyssey series, created an artistic bridge between classical mythology and African-American culture through works that conveyed a sense of timelessness and the universality of the human condition. Together, their works provide a complementary exploration of Bearden, one of the 20th century's most creative and original artists. On August 1st of 2015, Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell began her tenure as the 10th president of Spelman College, a leading liberal arts college for women of African descent located in Atlanta, Georgia. Spelman has long enjoyed a reputation as the nation's leading producer of Black women scientists. Prior to arriving in Atlanta, Dr. Campbell was a major force in the cultural life of New York City. Her work and career in New York, which included various challenging roles, began at the Studio Museum in Harlem, where she served for 10 years. New York's late Mayor Edward Koch invited Dr. Campbell to serve as the city's Cultural Affairs Commissioner in 1987. Dr. Campbell returned to the private sector to become Dean of New York University's Tisch School of the Arts in the fall of 1991. And in September of 2009, former President Barack Obama, our forever president, appointed Dr. Campbell as the Vice Chair of the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities as a nonpartisan advisory committee to the President of the United States on cultural matters. Dr. Campbell received her BA in English Literature from Swarthmore College. She earned her master's in art history as well as her PhD in humanities from Syracuse University. She holds honorary degrees from several colleges, including her alma mater, Swarthmore. Her work in American Odyssey, the life and work of Romare Bearden, received the 2018 Hooks National Book Award, and in 2019, she was a finalist for the 55th Georgia Author of the Year Award in the category of biography. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has served as a board member on the Alfred P. Sloan Board for 2008 to 2020 and was elected to the Unity Technologies Board in September 2020. She also serves on the boards of the J. Paul Getty Trust, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, and the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. Dr. O'Mealy is the Zora Hurston Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, where he has served on the faculty for 25 years. The founder and director of Columbia Center for Jazz Studies, O'Mealy is the author of The Craft of Ralph Ellison, Lady Day, The Many Faces of Billie Holiday, The Jazz Singers, and Romare Bearden, A Black Odyssey. His edited volumes include The Jazz Cadence of American Culture, Living with Music, Ralph Ellison's Essays on Jazz, History and Memory in African American Culture, the coveted Norton Anthology of African American Literature, and the Barnes & Noble's editions of Mark Twain, Herman Melville, and Frederick Douglass. For his production of Smithsonian record set called The Jazz Singers, he was nominated for a Grammy Award. O'Mealy has co-curated exhibitions for the Smithsonian Institution, Jazz at Lincoln Center, the High Museum of Art. He has held the Guggenheim and Coleman Fellowships and was recently a fellow at Columbia's new Institute for Ideas and Imagination at the Global Center in Paris. His new books are the Romare Bearden Reader and the Antagonistic Cooperation, Jazz Collage, and American Fiction. We invite you to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of the screen to engage both Dr. O'Mealy and Dr. Campbell as they explore Bearden tonight's work. And with that, I would like to open the discussion to Dr. Campbell.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. It's such a pleasure to be here. I love it every time I visit the California Afro-American Museum. So thank you for inviting me to participate tonight. And I can't think of a better person to be my partner in crime, Dr. Robert O'Mealy. I am such an admirer and fan of his work. So before I ask you to put the slides up, I just want to say I so wish I could see this exhibition, because the name is so intriguing. Men of Change, Truth, Triumph, and Power. What a wonderful name for an exhibition. So when I thought about putting together the slides for this evening's conversation, I thought about change in Bearden's work and Bearden's life. And there are three areas that I really want to focus on, just really 3 points. I have more slides than I have points, but I really just want to focus on 3 points. One is the tension in his life that was set up between what African Americans came to think of as necessary respectability in their lives in order to get ahead, and the tension that's set between the kind of transgressiveness or subversive resistance that also seemed to be necessary for us to kind of liberate ourselves from old identities. So that's one point I want to make. The second point I want to make is the role of discovery in his life. That he was an artist who was always searching, always seeking. So the whole theme of the Odyssey obviously makes so much sense in the context of his work. But I just wanted to make the point of where that this discovery took him as he came to collage. And finally, I just want to settle on the notion of reinvention. That part of what's wonderful about change is that it's an opportunity to rethink and re-envision and reinvent. So with that, let's go to the slides. So let's start, yes, thanks. Let's start right. Thank you. So one of the wonderful quotes that I love about Romare Bearden was a quote that August Wilson was moved to make when he saw this catalog. It's the catalog for Bearden's first major retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. Next slide. When Wilson opened that catalog, he said, "What I saw was Black life presented on its own terms, with all its richness and fullness, in a language made attendant to everyday life, ennobled it, affirmed its value, and exalted its presence." Next slide. And it is true that much of what Bearden's art does is this exaltation, is this lifting, is making our life, our everyday life, understanding what's regal and noble in it, such as this Sheba, this collage from 1970. Next slide. Or the wonderful lushness of something like Byzantine Dimension of 1971, where he's not only ennobling it, but he's drawing out the beauty of the Black body and making the analogy with the natural world. And this is very much a part of his life. And we'll see that celebration and affirmation of African-American life. Next slide. But there's also a part of Bearden that is just, for want of a better word, raunchy. And I show this collage. It's a very small collage from 1964, a time when he just first started making collages. If you look at the woman in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that kind of just unexpurgated representation of African-American life. Next slide. So that kind of intrigued me, that notion between, the noble and the affirmed, and the, just as I said, sort of unexpurgated. And I looked at that and began to understand that as part of a tension that exists, not just for Bearden, but for the African-American community. This is a slide of Bearden in his Long Island City studio. And what is most interesting about it is the photograph of the elderly couple sitting on their porch, who are his great-grandmother and great-grandfather. And he was born into their home in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1911. And he was born into the home of prosperous, middle-class, former slaves who were determined to use that sense of respectability to begin to build a generational citizenship for their family. Next slide. Here is Bearden standing as a little boy between those two great-grandparents, and behind him, his parents, and they are the very image of Black respectability. Next slide. The Beardens migrated to New York City around 1915, 1917, and Bearden's mother, Bessie Bearden, very quickly became the heart and soul of the family's social and civic life. She was a journalist. She was chair of the board of the school board in her area, and eventually a deputy tax collector. And she ran a very popular salon in her home. And for her, she was kind of one of these upright, upstanding citizens. And so Bearden was absolutely encapsulated in this sense of the well-bred, well-behaved African-American. Next slide. There were other aspects of Harlem as well that he would have immersed himself in. And one was the emergence during the 1920s in particular, this is actually from 1917, of a notion of social justice. African Americans began to really be able to define very clearly and articulate in very clear terms the unfair, inequitable treatment, and to protest in the name of remedying those inequities. And again, if you look at the first major protest in this country, organized protest, 8,000 marchers down Fifth Avenue, again, that whole sense of making sure they protest with a sense of dignity. Next slide. The sense of political agency was extremely keen, and it manifests itself in many ways. This is just one photograph of Marcus Garvey, one of many organizations of the way and representing many of the ways in which African Americans organize themselves. And in particular with this, the connection of organizing to go back to Africa, this sense of whatever predicament we were in right then and there, it did not cancel out the fact that there was a legacy and a history that went beyond the here and now, went beyond back to the originating continent. Next slide. Bearden grew up also in a community where this sense of affirmation, this sense of dignity and nobility carried over into the art world. And he had the good fortune to grow up and come of age in Harlem at a time when an artistic community was forming, a very, very rich, accomplished artistic community. Aaron Douglas being one example. Next slide. Augusta Savage being another. She actually had an art studio in Harlem and would invite young artists like Bearden, like Norman Lewis, like Jacob Lawrence into her studio and give them counsel and guidance on their professional development as artists. Next slide. And she became a mentor to these young artists, such that a young artist like Jacob Lawrence, he was young at the time, really began to hit his stride and his confidence during this era. So this whole notion of African-American community, of having a history, and this is the history of the migration. Lawrence had many series on aspects of African-American history. This was very much a part of that affirming sense that Bearden grew up in. Next slide. It is not surprising then that his earliest efforts at being an artist had this kind of very deep social justice theme to it. This is one of his earliest cartoons from the Crisis. He was also a cartoonist in college, but this was one of his earlier professional cartoons. And of course, it's on behalf of unemployed African-American workers during the Depression. Next slide. Bearden's cartoons could be very acerbic, as this one is, where he's equating the Klan with fascism in no uncertain terms, a swastika on the sleeve. Next slide. And when he tries his hand at the visual arts, again, he takes this very sort of solemn, dignified social justice theme, carrying that through in his first efforts as a painter. Next slide. But, and here's where the conflict comes in. That was Harlem by day. By night, Harlem had a completely different cast. It was a landscape of liberation. It was a landscape of experimentation, of invention, of crossing boundaries, of a kind of freedom that was not possible during the day and not possible in communities outside of Harlem, which made Harlem a magnet for people from around not only around the city, but around the world. And this is a map of that nightlife in Harlem that was done in 1931 by the cartoonist E. Sims Campbell. And he has all the, the hot spots that Bearden and his friends would prowl, calling themselves the Dawn Patrol. Next slide. And this defiance of norms was very bold. This is Gladys Bentley, who was a male impersonator, very popular one, and one of Bearden's favorites. He loved her very naughty, very wicked jokes. But it was exactly the kind of performance that you could enjoy as you went around as part of the Dawn Patrol. Next slide. That include also the performances of really great jazz musicians. This is a photograph of Cab Calloway and some of his dancers, his Coreens in the Cotton Club. Next slide. One of those Coreens took her act to Europe, to Paris in particular, and became a sensation, Josephine Baker. Next slide. And became an inspiration for some of our greatest artists. We now know, thanks to Denise Murrell, that Matisse not only saw Josephine Baker in Paris, but he may have seen her in Harlem, because he actually, we know from correspondence that he actually did visit Paris during the 30s and 40s. Next slide. So that kind of shows you the kind of tension that existed in Harlem between this desire to be affirming and noble and dignified, and the liberating influences of the cabaret scene, the nightlife in Harlem. And this is a tension that Bearden would work through in his work. Now I want to take us to just take a look at Bearden's kind of journey of discovery. Shortly after he got out of the Army, or actually while he was in the Army, he dropped all of his Black subject matter, and he turned to literature and began to cull from literature his themes and subject matter. And for the next almost 20 years, he really became overwhelmingly an abstract artist, as opposed to adopting social realism. And this is one of many, a painting from one of his many series that he did in the 1940s, from about 1945 to about 1949. Next slide. He had some success with that, with those paintings from that era. But the dealer who was working with him dropped him, and he went off to Paris, which again was part of his seeking, part of his journey of discovery. It's something many African-American artists, intellectuals, writers did. They went as expats and enjoyed a kind of freedom from the day-to-day kind of segregation, racism that they had to bear back in the United States. Next slide. Even though Bearden was not was dropped from his gallery, it didn't mean that he just completely gave up art. He organized himself in his own studio, which was located above the Apollo Theater. This is Bearden in his studio with some other artists on 125th Street in the 1950s. Next slide. Working from the model. Next slide. And again, he's seeking. He's doing. This is a sketch of one of those models that he worked with. And so he was, even though he was doing mostly abstraction, he was still working from the model, still exploring the human body. And then he got to a point in his career where he didn't quite stop painting, but he didn't paint regularly. He got into songwriting. He thought he could make money, and the money would allow him to bring himself back to Paris. And then he had a complete breakdown. Next slide. And he continues this period of discovery. When he returns to painting, he marries this wonderful woman, Annette Rohan, in 1954, and he returns to painting, and he paints almost totally non-objective work. Gradually, objects begin to come back into his painting. And then next slide. This period of discovery leads him to experiment more and more with collage. And we now know that those experiments maybe started as early as the 1950s and certainly continued in the 1960s. And after the March on Washington really accelerated. And this collage is the first collage that he exhibited in 1964 for a fundraiser. Next slide. And one of his friends said, well, why don't you photograph it? And he did, and he created this brand new way of representing and communicating the complexity of not only African-American life, but also all of the sum total of the journey that he had made. And I'm going to take us very quickly and wrap up so I don't take up all the time. This was his initial introduction of collage into the world in 1964. He did a whole series of constructing these small collages and then photographing them in large black and white. And this is what I call his period of invention, reinvention. He literally came back and reinvented his understanding of African-American culture, of painting, of construction, of the connections between our culture and other cultures. Next slide. He resurrected his memories of African-American folklore. This is a conjure woman. Next slide. He inflects this with his understanding of the Odyssey. He had done the series on the Iliad when he was doing his literary abstractions. And I'm going to leave it to Dr. O'Mealy to talk more about that, because that's truly his area. Next slide. And he brings back his memory of the cabaret scene. His memories of the cabaret went way back, and it wasn't until the 1970s when they began to recreate the history and heritage of jazz music that those memories of that nightlife began to flood back into his paintings with incredible luminosity and incredible sense of the vitality of performance, and just an incredible analogy between the way he was constructing his collage surfaces and the improvisation of the jazz music itself. Next slide. I'm going to end with this slide, which is comes from his autobiographical series, because it was really Bearden's, one of Bearden's very few self-portraits. And it really was his effort to collect on one canvas. And this is a magnificent piece of work. A slide does not do its justice. All of those different elements that went into making up his art. So at his elbow, you can see a reference to a painting by Duccio. You see his reliance on his earlier work, his working from the model. If you look at the pencil drawing that's at his feet, you can see a sketch of a Benin head. So drawing from different cultures, African cultures, Persian miniatures, European masterworks. So and also the material and medium of collage itself. And this is just a wonderful, rich summing up of the way in which he was able to wrangle those tensions between respectability and transgression, how he was able to reveal his journey of discovery and reveal his sense of reinvention. So that's the man of change. Thank you. Boy, I think I did that in what, 20 minutes.
And
Dr. O'Mealy?
yeah, I'm coming.
Awesome.
All right. First of all, I have to say what a pleasure it is, an honor it is to share the screen with this woman, with Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell. She's been the premier Bearden scholar for a very long time. And even before her magnificent book came out, people were cribbing from her dissertation and using her scholarship, and she's been a guide to us all. And so I'm happy to be able to thank you for your work and tell you how glad I am to be here with you. I'm also happy to be able to say that this show looks wonderful. I've only been able to see it online, but it's very exciting to do so. And to me, it's very moving to see the attention in this case to the brothers in the congregation. There's so much sister power, and rightly so. Our schools are 2/3 or more African-American women, the Black population here at Columbia and elsewhere. And the brothers can use a shout out. And I'm really glad to see this particular kind of celebration. And as you have already seen, Bearden returns the favor by presenting wonderful women, beautiful women, including women who are older, who are guardians of the tradition. The Benin woman that figure that you saw is part of a long tradition that goes right with the lovely goddesses that he also presents so lovingly. Today, I want to talk about the politics of Bearden a bit more than we've done already, The point I want to make is that the politics are in there in the work from the beginning, and they remain in the work, but they also can serve as a guide to us as we ask ourselves what we do in a time of calamity. What is the purpose of art now? What's the purpose of the academy at a time of near catastrophe in our social situation, in our national scene? What's an artist to do? Bearden was living through troubled times, of course, through his lifetime, and we can look at some of his solutions. I want to look at two shows in particular. I want to look mainly at the Odyssey show, but I want to glance at some of the early work. I'll be showing some of the same slides you've seen already. For one show, curated with wonderful Deirdre Harris Kelly and wonderful Daniel Dawson. On the left, we did a show on the artist as activist. And you see on the left a figure from that show, 1942. And then working with Seitz and Marquette Foley and her wonderful team at the Smithsonian, I co-curated this show that's represented on the right by this figure of Poseidon from the Odyssey show. So how do they fit together, these two things? How are they related to one another? is the question I want to ask. And the simple answer in a word is that they are very related, that there's one in the other. There's a yearning for a sense of universality in these more political, realistic portraits. And there's also a deep presiding love of the community that comes through in the Odyssey works as well. Both were intensely political. When he writes about the journey home, which is the Odyssey story, or when he portrays it in his work, he's thinking about the Black community as well as about the Greek community of the ancient world. He's thinking about ideas of home connecting with values and identity. What struck me about the Odyssey, he told an interviewer, is that all of us from the time we begin to think are on an Odyssey. In this case, home means looking for the values that are everlasting. And I think that's what makes the story so lasting, so classic, and applicable to everyone. So it's interesting that the trip home for him is kind of home to the homing keys, to the home values. And yes, he's thinking about Charlotte, and yes, he's thinking about Pittsburgh and Harlem and the Caribbean as he's doing these trips home. But he's also thinking about something more profound than that has to do with the values that can sustain us all. Why did he make all the people all the figures in the Odyssey Black? Of course, that's part of the political statement that he's making. Why were they all Black? He was interviewed by Callaloo magazine. Well, everyone says this is a universal statement, he said. It has to do with the search for a father. So if a child in Benin, he goes on to say, or a Black child in Alabama sees my paintings of Odysseus, he can understand my myth better. So he's got a political point here. He wants to make you know that this is a myth that's available to you, and that if there's a universality to be had, you're part of it as well. Fred Moten spoke at Columbia a few years ago when our Bearden Odyssey show came here, and he pointed out that the Odyssey emphasizes the position of homeless Black Americans, tossed and driven by circumstances, fighting for breaks in the manifold pattern of the violence that they face. I want to show a little clip from Columbia's hype of the show, and I sort of want to say don't believe the hype right from the beginning, but there are gold nuggets in the midst of it. Fred speaks, and there are other speakers. You'll hear from Cameron Carter, from the poet Alice Oswald, and from Andrew Segedie-Mazak. Fred speaks first. He speaks low, so you have to give him your attention. He's talking about the Odyssey and how it pertains to Black America. And this was the time of the crisis in Ferguson. And he said, how could I come here and talk about the Odyssey without talking about Ferguson? How can we not?
How could we not have talked about Ferguson? And everything that it indicates, and everything that it replicates for us as another moment in a long history of brutality. But it's also another moment in a long history of homelessness, it seems to me. And in this respect, it's part of our general Black Odyssey. Odysseus, in some sense, appealed to Bearden precisely because he saw an affinity between Odysseus's own homelessness or restlessness and our own.
Black life has always been a faith act. It's always been the practice of a certain kind of faith, the name of which is the practice of freedom, we might say.
It would be like hearing Charlie Parker play Chopin, it would just change, You can feel Bearden's hand kind of moving these pieces of paper around on the collage, and it's okay, that's where that's supposed to go.
Odysseus, even after he arrived at home and was welcomed, decided to go off again. And I think that's the kind of choice that we face now, to accept, the sort of the exigencies and brutalities that they go with claiming the United States as it is presently construed and constructed as home? Or should we choose homelessness again? Choose to set out again for some different place, for another world, for another country, as Baldwin would say.
The ancient works are like the constellations. They're always the same, and they're always changing.
That line is a kind of shaft of light coming into the poem.
Improvisation corresponds to the history that we are and the history that we live. It's what we do when we make something out of nothing. And it becomes both the method of our survival, but also the object of study for us as we try to understand our survival.
So how fascinating to think about the Odyssey as a story of a search for home, but as a story about a homeless man, and who, as we know, goes back to Ithaca and then sets out again. And so it's interesting to think about it as a Black story that Bearden was Blackenizing, but which he saw the Black elements. And here's the Bearden that we are most familiar with, the Bearden who is, I think, doing collages about musicians, these wonderful pieces, very often landscapes of the South, sometimes of Harlem, like the ones Dr. Campbell showed. And there's that. It says they're wonderful images of the fast life, as we were hearing about in the Harlems of the United States. But the Odyssey series in 1977 takes a different direction. And it's related to those, and also related, as I've said, to this idea of social change imperative that we see in the work. As you've seen already too, he began as a political cartoonist in his professional work. My original ambition was to be a political cartoonist, he said. And so you get these pieces that are directly in your face about issues that are current. But as he moved from political art in that sense, he moved, I think, to capital letter political art, the art of the polis, of the city, of the community. How can you make art that is enduring and that is not just of the particular moment? How did he do it? He did it through the careful study of painting technique and the distilling of a personal artistic language with international resonances. He discerned his own way of doing things through careful study. He embraced what he called the prevalence of ritual as a strategy for expressing Black American experience as exemplary of human experience. That key is very important. So now, yes, it's a woman washing, or yes, it's a baptism, but he sees them as rites of purification, part of worldwide continuum, a worldwide continuum of rituals. He saw art as revelatory and redemptive. He wasn't much of a church man, but there's something churchy in his work, where there's a sense of hope and belief in the continuity and the redemption of mankind, the fact that there will be continuity despite the difficulties. It's significant, though, that he never gave up his political work of encouraging Black artists. He starts these organizations, he's active in them, he supports the Studio Museum, he's working with Spiral, and that's part of what that's part of the answer for him. How do you work as a political activist and an artist? It's also significant that from 1935 to 1969, with some breaks during that, when he was finally able to pursue art full time, he led something of a double life, working by day as a social worker, as a social investigator on the city's Romani. The vulgar term is the gypsy population. And on nights and weekends, apparently during the days, as an indefatigable artist. The people who work with him said he was on the phone doing his job with the Romani and drawing with the other hand. So that gives another model of how we can do things. We work with the people in our community to start organizations and encourage young artists, but also we can get other work done. We can have day work that we do while we pursue our art. An artist is an art lover who finds that in all art he sees that something is missing. To put there what he needs to be there becomes the center of his life's work. So he's working as an artist while working as a social worker and working with the community, but trying to find his own way. What's missing from the art that he was studying? This search for a personal voice, for a cosmopolitan Black, you might say an unruly cosmopolitan Black voice that puts together, as Dr. Campbell was saying, that the respectability and the funky Savoy ballroom stuff too, puts it together. That in itself is political, making it clear that you can be both these people in one person. Here you've seen this painting already. As he looks back to a work of 1941, The Visitation, there he is in the painting, looking back at that work, and in his across the chair next to him is the piece, is his own hand being cut out. So he's showing you the process whereby he's working things through, finding his own way of doing things. Yes, he's drawing on European art. Yes, he's drawing on classical African art as well. The sketch that we've heard about, this fabric, all becomes part of his searching and finding his own way to do things. Music remained important for him. So we'll see why this pertains to the Odyssey series. But I love this album cover that he did for Columbia Records for Billie Holiday. If you look closely in the middle of the work, there's a figure. He doesn't do self-portraits. There's one that he announces it in. I see Bearden in there, walking through the curtain that Billie Holiday is opening up for him. He said his favorite song by her was a song called When the Moon Turns Green. And he gives you how many? 1, 2, at least 3, 4, 5 moons, several of them green. And there's Bearden coming through. As a jazz musician, you can be technically great if you're a jazz musician, but if you haven't got your own voice, then you're not part of the team. And he wanted to be part of the team. And he was friends with Billie Holiday, and had his sense of becoming himself had to do with this kind of example. And so when he does the Sirens, he knows about this painting here, not painting, but this vase of the Sirens as dangerous monster women. You have to plug up your ears. You want to hear their voice, but they'll kill you if you get too close to them. But when he does that same image, he makes them these lovely, beautiful musicians, singers, kind of Matisse-like lovelies calling him. And you might say with Helene Sissos, maybe we need to listen to that song. Maybe it's not such a fearsome thing after all. He makes it seem awfully good. We'll come back to that shortly. His in the Odyssey, the character, is searching for the father, but Bearden's characters are following again and again these female characters. Look at his Circe. She's an Afro-Eurasian goddess with the snake as a power of transition and long life, living again in one hand, and the lion at her feet. She's a figure of power who certainly is related to these conjure women, some of whom you've seen already, and that he knew in the South and also in Pittsburgh. Here's Circe again, now as a reclining nude. I love that he makes, it's not the train in the distance, as was often the case in his work, but the ship that's leaving, as the Odysseus is leaving Circe behind. But notice that at her feet, there's kente cloth. She's a figure, like so many figures of the blues, as Bearden sees them, of tremendous beauty, and with this connection with the motherland and with the sense of power that goes with that. She certainly is related to patchwork quilt at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York, and to this tradition of quilters. And by the way, the Romani also were quilters. he no doubt saw quilts in their homes as he moved around. And he wants to honor this tradition, which he knew very well was a women's tradition of making art that you could use. And also women who just look good, look good, look good. He wanted you to not to miss that fact either. And so when he does the profile series, a later one, here's another figure who is related to Circe, this another reclining nude. It's now, as I say, it's not the ship in the distance, but the train moving by. And it just strikes me, if you look closely at my sister here, she's has a nice little smile saying, you know, she's listening to the whistle blow as the caption to the painting tells us, and feeling good as she lies here. She's not, in other words, the classic kind of stereotype figure of the woman left behind, the blues. She might be glad he's gone, for one thing. I'm a man concerned with truth, Bearden said, not flattery, who shares a dual culture that's unwilling to deny either the Harlem where I grew up or the Harlem of the Dutch masters that contribute its element to my understanding of art. This is very important when we think about Bearden and his studies toward becoming somebody with his own voice. Here, he's got the Renaissance Italian art in mind on the left, but then he remakes it again with figures all black and with the Benin reference, those sculptural heads showing that there's a classical tradition in Africa as well. So the more you know about his African references, the more you can appreciate what he's also doing with the European ones. I like to think about the idea of going home as related to the word repair, kind of, I think I would repair home. There's another way we use that word. And I think that in Bearden, he's concerned about getting home in that sense of repairing home, but he's also interested in repairing, and literally in reconnecting these parts of our society that are at odds with one another. And so when he does the Odyssey series, here we have Troy with the city burning and one side of the city against one another. Now, Bearden has known the riots of the 40s and the riots of the 60s, and the sense, too, that the Civil War in the United States continues, that we are at one another's throats. How can we repair ourselves? And hey, what about reparations as part of this as we think about repair? Homer's epics involved Poseidon, Bearden told an interviewer. Poseidon, who has always come up from Africa where he wants to be with his friends there. So it's natural that Bearden would make Poseidon black, and it is universal. So if a child in Benin or Louisiana, as I read before, sees my paintings, he can understand the myth better. So here's his sea god. And to me, it's very moving that this sea god knows how many bodies have gone down in that sea, how many, the many millions gone. And he's very angry about all kinds of things we can imagine. And he's Poseidon by Homer is furious. This guy is more furious. He's angry about the way, for one thing, the way his children have been treated. He's related, again, but Bearden explicitly relates him to a Nigerian mask tradition, a sculptural tradition, something that we see elsewhere in his work. But he's also reminding us that this is Poseidon, who's somebody's father. Poseidon is the father of the Cyclops. And here Bearden is not just trying to think what Homer might do with the Cyclops. He's reinventing on the figure on the left. He makes into a kind of a terrible 2-year-old child. The Cyclops' baby boy. And he makes us turn the myth around and ask, why did you come to take to steal from him? What is that? And so Bearden refocuses the epic as a Black story to make his point explicitly political. Earlier, he'd done another Cyclops that we haven't seen very often. I saw this only recently. Look at this Cyclops. He's got a thumb piano in the middle of his face. He's standing in what Robert Ferris Thompson calls a power stance. And behind him looks like what Mary showed us, those Klansmen hovering over him. But it's as if Bearden says, this time my boy is ready. He looks like he's ready to explode with that bullet of a body of his, and with all of that Haitian or Caribbean or African juju that he's wearing as well. This idea of the family comes through in the Odyssey in unexpected places. We're told by Homer that Scylla and Charybdis are there to kill you. He makes the figure a mother protecting her nest. And you better not come near this family. Just like Poseidon is looking out, she's looking out too. So he turns the thing around to his own purposes. Again and again, it's the woman you must follow. Ino, in this telling, goes down and saves Odysseus. She wraps him in kente cloth and saves him. And so here's a reinvention of the myth to the highest degree. I'm moving toward finishing up, but I don't want you to miss this fact that there she is, she's going down to get him, and she's wrapping him in this kente cloth. And it's as if Bearden is saying we need to wrap ourselves in our heritage and know who we are, and thank God for these women. Where would we be without people like Bessie Bearden, his own mother, people like Mrs. Rohan, his own wife, looking out for the community and bringing salvation to our community. I want to end with this image. This is his siren song. Bearden said, what's painting? Painting is putting one thing over another. And I think what we have here is one thing over another. We have the siren song as Homer presented it, the women singing, enticing him. Bearden changes it by making them beautiful and making us wonder if we shouldn't follow the example of these musicians, singers. He also makes the mast a cross. So we're made to ask, oh my goodness, is that a Christ figure hanging from that cross? And are they paying a kind of homage to that figure? Is that part of what the story is? But wait a minute, is that man lynched at the top of that pole? Gwendolyn Brooks said, maybe Christ was the most beautiful lynchy of them all. I think Bearden wants us to use this as a conversation piece and ask us if the Sirens were the people who not only were beautiful and had beautiful song, but who know everything, might it not be worthwhile to hear their song? Don't we need to know what they know? Don't we need to make the sacrifice implied here to survive the land that we live in? So he makes it a beautiful, colorful, Matisse-like, splendidly vegetable garden at the beach, but he also makes it a protest piece against lynching, reminding us that Black men have been heroes, as Christ, the greatest hero, was a hero, but we've been sacrificing and sacrificing. And when will we find a way to draw ourselves together as one family? I'll end there.
Lovely. Thank you both so much for these incredibly rich presentations on the life and work of Bearden. With that, I want to go ahead and open us up to question and answer. We have a number of questions from our attendees this evening. I also want to remind people that they are able to use the question and answer feature if they have questions that have not been entered into the Q&A yet. The first question we can start with is, where are the Odyssey paintings? How many are those? I'm sorry, how many are there? Did he ever make graphics of these marvelous works?
It isn't so easy to answer any of those questions or either of those questions. He did 20 or 21 of the Odyssey collages. He also had been thinking about it, as Mary said earlier when he did the Iliad pieces, and there are pieces between the series that we've looked at and the achievement of this series in the late 1970s that are also referring to the story. So I would take that into account, 20 or 21. The red Circe that we looked at, that beautiful, I call it Afro-Eurasian figure. It was not formally part of the series as Bearden did it, and yet she's Circe who's part of it. So there's that those are some complication. The other complication is that Bearden then did a watercolor reproduction of the series. He did at least 2 more sets, and then there were spin-offs. There's one at Hammond House that I never saw anywhere else. That's a watercolor spin-off from the series. He did 6 silk screens that he sold as a set. But you can still, if you go on one of the sites, and you can find 6 of the most beautiful ones, including the one we're looking at now, for sale. The paintings sell for a $250,000 or so, many of them. And then, but this set you can get for much less money. They sold, I think, for $1,000 for the whole set at first, and now you can get them for $2 or $3 grand each, and they are quite beautiful. And quite relatively easy to find.
Lovely. Dr. Campbell, one of the questions that we have here is asking about Bearden and his relationship with friends and colleagues. The question notes, was he friends or colleagues with other people in New York political artists such as Ben Shahn or others?
Yes, he was very much connected to artists who had a political bent. In Harlem alone, artists like Aaron Douglas were very much a part of the political scene, particularly during the WPA. And Douglas was one of the leaders of the Harlem Artists Guild, and who organized the artists and organized them in an effort for them to be able to fight for their share of the work WPA projects. But even outside of the Harlem Circle, he became friends with Walter Kurt, who, although he was an abstract artist, was incredibly political. Ad Reinhardt, also again, another abstract artist, but an artist who was extremely political. He had done a very radical assault on racism while he was in the army, and when he came out, he did his famous tree documenting the New York art world. Stuart Davis was another politically active artist that became a mentor to Bearden. So I think you have to remember that during the Depression, when there was the WPA, artists felt they had to organize and they had to lobby and advocate on behalf of themselves to make sure that they were getting the kind of support from the New Deal that went to other forms of labor and workers. So it was a kind of naturally political era with a lot of attention to injustices, which you could see from his cartoons, which you could see from the content of other painters from that era.
Lovely. One of the questions that we have here is related to Bearden's wife. It says, I just learned on Google that he married a dancer. Did he ever create any art using her?
So She herself, yes, was also not only a dancer, she was a model and a very successful one at that. In fact, she was in publications like Ebony advertising Colgate toothpaste or Vaseline or products like that. And I think even some television commercials. And she was quite beautiful. There's some wonderful photographs of her sort of standing like a model next to Bearden's paintings. But I don't know that by the time he got to collage, that he was in fact working from a live model at all. That I think it was during the 1950s before he met Nanette.
Lovely. This question is for you, Dr. O'Mealy. Question notes, I thought the Odyssey was about getting home to, and it says to wife, I'm assuming to his wife, the main figure's wife. If you could speak to that question, would be helpful.
Yes, Odysseus, thank you for the question. Odysseus is on his way home to meet his wife, Penelope. And it's like a sailor's yarn in the sense that, oops, on the way I met Circe, a Calypso, and Nausicaa was looking awfully good. So there are tales of his dalliances on the way home, but he's on his way home to meet the famously faithful Penelope. And one of but I think it's important to say that just as Bearden was improvising his own retelling of this tale, Homer was an improviser too. He was picking up things from the oral tradition. So in some cases, Penelope is faithful and waiting. Some cases, she doesn't wait. She splits on him. There are versions that he does different things that happen. And so I think it's important to recognize that it's a fluid tale. And it's also important to recognize that when he gets home, it is Penelope's craftiness and her brilliancy of her improvisation that recognizes him and figures out what to do to keep him home. So there have been several writers who have done their own women's versions of the Odyssey, starring Penelope as a woman of agency and power.
Incredible. This question can be for either of you. I'm sure both of you can probably speak to it. It says, I know of Bearden's work, but don't know how his work came to fame. Who celebrated him to ensure his work was seen, and when was that?
So that's a really interesting question because there was an ebb and flow with Bearden's work. So when he first started to paint, and he had his first exhibition, I guess, in the 1940s, he got a fair amount of attention for it in the Black press. And he became known among his Harlem friends and colleagues, and who were, of course, incredible intellectuals and poets and painters and artists themselves. He goes away to serve in the Army during World War II. He comes back, he has completely changed his work to these literary abstractions. And he joined something called the Coots Gallery, which is all white, Midtown Gallery. And he has, I would say, moderate fame. Every time he exhibits, his exhibit is covered by the critics. He's almost always reviewed favorably, but he's not a household name by any means. It so happens that the other artists in Coots were people like Robert Motherwell, Adolf Gottlieb, eventually Hans Hofmann. And when this gallery dealer closed down Coots, and Bearden was kind of kicked out, so to speak, when he reopened without Bearden, but he focused on these artists who later became, of course, abstract expressionists, which became the rage in American art. and for a decade dominated American painting. And Bearden just wasn't feeling abstract expressionism. That wasn't where his art was going. And so again, his fame subsided. When he returned after going to Paris, and he returned to New York, and he went through his period of songwriting and his breakdown, and he came back to abstract painting, once again, he got good reviews. He had shows. He had a new dealer, Corday Ekstrom. Once again, he had some moderate fame. But it was not until he exhibited those projections in October of 1964, when he opened with his show of projections, it exploded. He was in the New York Times. He was in Newsweek magazine. He was featured everywhere. Museums were after him. Galleries were after him. His fame just exploded. Why? Because, to Bob's point, his sense of the politics of that period, of the churn, of the explosiveness, of the defiance of that period, was perfectly aligned with the work that he was making at that time. And from that moment on, and I would say from that moment on until he died, until the end of his life, his artwork seemed to just be like a Geiger counter that could just detect all of the tremors and fault lines that were going on in the country, and reflect them positively and negatively in his artwork. And that's when he really came to fame.
I wonder, Alexandra, if I could ask Mary a question. Can you hear me? Are we good?
Yeah, sure.
I'm really interested in Nanette Bearden, and I so enjoyed reading about her in your book. It was a revelation to me. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about her as a dance company leader, but also as somebody whose magazines and he's seeing those cutouts on the floor, and somebody who is a seamstress. Can you say a word about these things?
You know, Bob, I'm so glad you said that, because it really annoyed me profoundly to see the way she was not only discounted, but sometimes just completely erased from conversations about Bearden, almost as if she was marginal. And in fact, she was his North Star when he was at his lowest. Yep. When he was hospitalized, and he really had kind of completely lost his sense of direction and his conviction about painting and art, etc. She was the one who said, "You got to start painting again." And they were living together with his father in Harlem and Morningside Heights. He said, "And we got to move out of here." And they moved down to Chinatown, to Canal Street. And she really helped him get back to painting and understand that that's who he was. He was a painter, an artist. And at the same time, she loved dance, loved dance. And he sort of reciprocally helped her start this dance company, which was the Nanette Bearden Dance Company. And he would make prints for her, to help raise money. They went to every dance concert together they could go to. Richard Long was a big dance fan, and they would go together. And in fact, it was through Richard Long that he met Alvin Ailey. And Bearden began this collaboration with Alvin Ailey and the choreographers with Ailey, and did these wonderful sets for Ailey and for Diane McIntyre. And so Nanette's interest in dance spurred his collaboration with other dancers. When it comes to the collage, he has said on many occasions that, you know, Nanette loved to have her magazines, her women's magazines, Harper's, as well as Ebony, and all these magazines. And he would start making the clippings from her magazines as well as, you know, National Geographic, or there was an African journal, I can't think of the name of it offhand. It was very famous, very highly regarded journal of African art. So you would get those clippings of the great Benin sculptures and include those African antiquities. And he put all the clippings in a bag. And when he was meeting with his friends at Spiral, he took the bag and he actually tried to get them to work with him on a group collage, and they weren't having any of it. And so he took them back home and he put together the collage. Nanette also was a seamstress. She made almost all their clothes. And he would take the scraps from her when he was doing as his collage changed and shifted. You know, he did collages from fabrics, and he did collages that had the feeling of quilts. So they were incredible collaborators, and she was a very quiet presence. She never sought any, you know, fame for herself or acknowledgement for herself, but she was absolutely essential, not only to his recovery, but his continued development and inspiration.
We have a mutual friend, Sarah Jasmine Griffin, who said that people talk about the train, and the train is crucial to Bearden. Travel and escape and the Underground Railroad and all of that goes with it. But Farah said, don't forget those sewing machines that show up again and again.
Right.
And those dressmakers standing there with those young girls and shaping those young people with their hands. And Farah said that she herself grew up, remembers as a child being underneath her mother's, the sound of the singer going. And there's an empowerment, a message in that sound and in that vision that Bearden conveys as well.
Yeah, that making and constructing and pulling together and taking bits and pieces and pulling it together. Yeah.
We have a question from our dear friend and colleague, Deidre Harris Kelly of the Romare Bearden Foundation. Deidre asks, she has a question about the Bearden selection in the show, which I'll share my screen with shortly to show you all. It's this question about the show, Men of Change. Can you say what went into the piece on Bearden? What is meant to say about the artist? And she also says, great presentation. So I'm going to share my screen so we all can see the work, because we were not able to see it in person, unfortunately. But the piece is by Patrick Earl Hammy, and sorry, I had such a unfortunate sharing. It's such a large file.
Yeah, I've never seen this, Alessandra. When was this done?
I actually do not have the date in front of me at the moment, but I think it was a piece commissioned for the show specifically.
Oh.
But I wanted to share this with our audience since Deirdre posed the question.
It is beautiful. How big is it?
No, it's rather large. It takes up quite a bit of the wall during the install at CAM. I don't have the exact dimensions. I wish I had more specifics in front of me at the moment, but I just wanted to pull this up quickly while we were in conversation.
Mm.
It evokes, don't you think, the portraits of Bearden, one by Frank Stewart.
Yeah.
And then there's another one, I don't know who does, you know, where Bearden is looking out at you. But it was very smart to do it as a composite of images, and so you get different colors in the face and different parts of his body. It's beautiful.
Beautiful, beautiful work.
Lovely. Another question is, it was mentioned that Bearden had a breakdown. Did he continue doing art during this time? And can you speak more about just that time period in his life generally?
So as a prelude to that, you know, I found it interesting because I read a lot of biographies in preparation for writing a biography. And one of the things I noticed was the disturbing number of artists who experienced breakdowns. Jacob Lawrence had one earlier. Actually, he was much younger. He had come out of right after World War II. Charlie Mingus, as a jazz musician, you know, had a breakdown. Bearden. I mean,
Mary Lou Williams.
Mary Lou Williams. I mean, you know, we could probably sit here all night and name African-American artists. And so I don't want to generalize, because I'm sure each one had a very specific path to that rupture. But Bearden had stopped painting. I will say he was painting intermittently when he got back from Paris. He didn't paint at all while he was in Paris. He had a good time. He was there for about 5 months, and he really said, you know, he just really let himself get soaked up in Paris. And when he came back, he couldn't quite get back to painting regularly. And he was convinced that he wanted to return to Paris. And so he took up songwriting as a way of making money. And he kind of, he was there at the Apollo. So, you know, he was surrounded by other composers, musicians, etc. So he actually had some songs that had moderate success, but he wasn't painting regularly. And he really kind of got sort of away from himself, so to speak. I love that image from Fred Moten, Bob, about homelessness. I think that Bearden experienced a kind of spiritual homelessness at this point. And he had stopped painting. By the time he had this breakdown, he had stopped painting. And it was his marriage to Nanette and her kind of bringing him back home to himself when he began to paint on a regular basis.
Can I say a word about that too? So often we think about the artist goes to Paris and is happily ever after. But as I say, Mary Lou went to Paris and then to London and had a nervous breakdown. Mm-hmm. And the great thing about all the people that Mary's mentioned and about Mary Lou too is that they were able to bounce back.
That's right.
And there's Jacob Lawrence coming back, and Mary Lou began the new part of her life, and so did Bearden. But it's important to record that there are these difficulties along the way. How hard it must have been to be an artist in early 1950, come back from the exhilaration of Paris to this, right. I mean, finding ourselves, you know, with so much. What were we going to say?
And I want to say something else about 1950s. We don't. I think the 1950s is a decade that we really need to look at really hard. Not only was Bearden coming back in the 1950s. 1950s was a period of McCarthy. It was when artists themselves, making art itself, was under suspicion. It was a period when many of the people whom Bearden revered were now being persecuted by the United States government. Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois. So this was not a good. I mean, this was not a flourishing time. It was a very difficult time to be an artist, period, and particularly for Black artists.
He's back. His mother has passed away, and now he's come back to New York without her, living with his father. And he said one Bearden had such a. You and I met him and knew him a bit, and he had a wonderful sense of humor and a wonderful storytelling talent. And when he told this story, sometimes he would say, "Yeah, as I was coming down the steps from Bellevue, I realized that the wall had been a fresco that was now painted over, and I remembered that someone would work with the Mexican muralists that made frescoes there, and I was feeling the wall as I went down the stairs, and I was very excited by that. And my father was talking to the attendant, and the attendant says, "That's your boy coming down the steps there, feeling the wall?" He said, "Yeah, that's him. I believe that boy's coming back here. They're feeling all the wall." So Bearden made a joke out of it, but he did have to come back. And I read that scene also as saying, you know, even when you put the paint on the wall and try to cover, somehow art will find a way to get through. So there's that. He also tells the story of Nanette. He honors her, just as you've said. He was taking pills to keep him from being nervous. He said, "You got to throw away all of the pills. You are an artist."
Right.
he said that one of the ways that he liked to work was to work through the day as a painter and then leave a little something off so that in the morning he'd have a place to start.
Right.
And I think what happened is he woke up in the morning and he thought, got to get going. I can't wait to get going. And that was the home that he needed to get back to with Annette, and the sense of peace that she brought him, and encouragement and inspiration, but also, as you've said, to the home of painting again.
Right.
We're coming close to the end of our question and answer section, and we've had such incredible questions from our audience. I just want to ask one more before I close this out for the evening, if you all will allow. The question says, will you speak about Bearden's World War II service and the racism he experienced and how that influenced his work after the war?
I don't know about this, so maybe Mary does.
So that was fascinating to learn. That was something that I learned in the course of doing the research for the book, because I didn't know much about his service. And one of the resources that I turned to was the Black press. And we have to remember that the Black press in that day and age was the be all and the end all. That was how we got our news. We read the newspaper, we passed it on. At a certain point, the Baltimore Afro-American, it was estimated had a readership, not a circulation, but a readership that exceeded that of the New York Times, because we had such a voracious appetite for these. So looking through the Black press and looking at some of the commentators, I came across this remarkable column by one of the very famous columnists of the day that described some of Bearden's difficulties in the Army. And as I pursued it, as I began to look at correspondence that he did during that period to various people, I began to see the evidence of it, of how ridiculous it was to have a segregated army in World War II. He said that they were so strict with the segregation that they would take two of them, if there were two African Americans and everybody else, and set up a whole dining hall just exclusively for them, so that the Black artists, the Black soldiers and the white soldiers were not mixed. And he documented as he went from one location to the next in the United States. He never served abroad. He managed not to have to serve abroad. And ultimately, after he had been in the Army for a while, he actually managed to get assigned to one of the newspapers and actually be able to work as a graphic artist for some time. But it was a deeply segregated army. He hated it. He wrote about how he was treated and how absurd it was for them to be separated, and the kinds of the pointless distinctions that they made. So it's my feeling that the Army was one of the first real experiences of Jim Crow that he experienced as an adult, because he spent most of his coming of age, and except for going off to college, he went to Lincoln for a while, he went to Boston University, but he ended up at NYU. Most of his time was spent in Harlem. He went to Pittsburgh as a child. He spent some time in Pittsburgh. But most of his time was in Harlem, surrounded by people who were affirming to him. And then he goes off to the United States Army, and he has this experience, and it's bracing.
Lovely. Well, I have the great honor of saying thank you to you both live. We've received so many thank yous for this conversation. It's been the quintessential art history lesson on Bearden, and our audience is thankful. I'm thankful. We're thankful to Cam that you all were able to join us this evening. I urge you all as attendees to purchase both the American Odyssey, The Life and Work of Romare Bearden by Dr. Campbell, and the Romare Bearden Reader, edited by Dr. Neale. Both of them are available online. If you can, please purchase them via SOM Books, one of our favorite local LA Black-owned bookstores. We also urge you to explore the online exhibition resources for sites for the Men of Change exhibition. They're available via the CAM website. And we want to thank, of course, again, thank Sites for their work with this exhibition and our friends and colleagues there, Ford Motor Company. And we look forward to welcoming you back to see the exhibition in person. It's installed. It's a really beautiful and incredible exhibition. Bearden is, of course, just one of the many men featured in this really timely and relevant exhibition. And with that, I'm going to close this out. You all be safe and be as well as possible during these times. And we all just wish you the best. And thank you both again.
Thank you.
Everybody have a great night.
Good night.
Good night.